Julie Berry has been one of the best-loved voices in London for over 20 years. She was the original voice model for BT's directory Enquiries and is still the voice of London Underground's Piccadilly line. And she's with us here today. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you, Toby. How are you?
I'm doing great today, yeah. Now, what's it like to be a voiceover artist, first of all?
Oh gosh, that's a very broad question. I've had a fantastic career. I have to say, I'm knocking on a bit nowadays, and I'm sort of on the point of retirement. But I did my first voiceover in 1981. That's how long I've been doing it.
Wow.
And in the last however many years that is, I've had a wonderful time. Stressful sometimes, but.
Yeah.
You never know what you're going to get. You get into the studio, you get given the script, you never know what it's going to be. And or at least rarely do you get the script. Sometimes if it's something medical, for example, they might send it to you in advance because it may have lots of technical stuff in it. But no, it's rare. I mean, I've done all sorts of corporate and other kinds of narrative, as well as radio and TV commercials like There Was No Tomorrow, and you never know what you're going to get. So you have to think on your feet. And I've always loved that challenge. And back in the day, when I first started, we didn't have digital. Digital has made such a difference to everything, because nowadays, if you're doing, for example, a TV ad, if they want a particular word to hit a particular picture, then they can slide it around to do that, as long as there's enough room in the script. When I started, part of the craft was being able to make sure that word landed on that picture or on that cut. And that was part of the fun, as far as I was concerned.
And what's the kind of day-to-day life like? Because I'm guessing it's definitely not a normal 9-to-5 job, so your routine would be very different from an average person, I suppose.
Yes, and certainly when I was doing a lot of work in London studios, which I haven't done a lot of in the last 10 years or so, I suppose, but when I was, it was very much, I would get up and get ready to go just in case. When I moved to the house that I live in at the moment, which was about 25 years ago, I'll never forget the first day after I moved. I spent most of the morning trying to sort out my study and all those kind of things. And I just sat down with something for lunch, and the phone rang, and it was my London agent, Sue at Hobson's, saying, Jules, how quickly can you get into town? And I said, about half an hour. Quickly put on some slap, got into some decent trousers, clean trousers, and off I went. Got back, did more sorting in the afternoon, had just sat down with a cup of tea, and the phone went again at about 5 o'clock. Sorry, it's late, but how quickly can you get to Wild Tracks or Tape Gallery or whichever studio it was? So, it's like with the script, you never know what your day is going to be like. And you only know if you're going to have a good week when you get to the end of it.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting because you kind of started out working in theatre and on acting things, right?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, my parents, bless them, insisted that at drama school I do a teacher's course. Because, of course, I was never going to be successful as an actress, was I? And I would have to earn a living. So thanks for your faith, Mum and Dad. But anyway, so I did a teacher's course at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in the City of London. And I went back to do a postgraduate year, actually, in Elizabethan and Jacobean drama. And when I came out of there, I'd already been asked on my postgrad year if I would teach a junior group at the Guildhall School. So I did that for about 5 years. And meanwhile, I went to work, first of all, in a school in Harley Street, teaching what they like to call elocution, what I called speech and drama. And then I wound up in a theatre school, Mountview Theatre School, where I taught speech and voice this is for trainee actors. And I also taught Shakespeare, and I directed Shakespeare plays. And then I got to my sort of late 20s and thought, actually, it's really time I went and did this myself. And I had a splendid time in my 30s I was in the West End for quite some time in a long-running comedy. I did a big TV play of the month for the BBC. I spent a very happy year on the radio rep making radio plays for the BBC, which I loved. I think that was my favourite ever job. Yeah. And I think it was around about that time I decided I really wanted to be behind the microphone. I was already doing voiceovers rather sporadically while I was in the West End. And then I did this big job that you mentioned for British Telecom as the voice model for director Enquiries. And suddenly all the people that I'd been doing sort of funny voices and accents for the sort of 5 or 6 years before that. And the show that I was in was set in a girls' school in 1927. So it's full of people who spoke like this, and I was a frightfully far back kind of teacher. And so I got used an awful lot for that kind and variations of that kind of voice, whether it was sweet young thing, that kind of posh, or far back kind of, or ancient posh. And so I capitalised on that. But then when I did the job for British Telecom, they discovered that I had a straight voice and started using me for my straight voice. And that's when it really took off.
Yeah. And then how did you manage to get to work on the Piccadilly line announcements?
That was a sort of a bizarre thing, really, because sometime in the 80s, it would have been a friend of a friend who was an actor who did railway announcements, asked his friend, our mutual friend, if he knew of a female voiceover artist who would be up for doing some railway announcements. And he said, but it's got to be, a nice, soft, warm voice, not Minnie Mouse. The first voiceover job I ever did, actually, was for someone who said, I never use female voiceovers. So a long time ago. I never use female voiceovers. Why not? Because they all sound like Minnie Mouse. So... And a friend of mine who ran a studio, we'd been at Guildhall at the same time, said to this particular client, if I find you a voice who's not Minnie Mouse, would you use her? And he said yes. And that was how I initially got started. And so with the railway stuff, I was taken to this place I did an audition first to see if I was the right kind of voice, because this was very early days of speech processing, and you had to be very precise, and you had to be able to do short phrases that would link together very well. And it was some years later, in fact, it was a decade or two later, when I did the announcements with those same people at that same studio for the Piccadilly line.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because I think most of the train announcements I've heard are women. So did that used to not be the case?
I'm not sure. I think a lot. I mean, it has changed a lot now. I think there was a time when apparently they did a survey of airline pilots about what kind of voices they wanted to hear from the equipment in the cockpit. And the word came back, the feedback was that they didn't want women's voices because they tuned them out. So it had to be an authoritative male. And for many years, on TV commercials, for example, if they wanted, if you were, as a client, you wanted people to think that your product was really trustworthy, it had to be a male voice because people trusted male voices. I mean, we're going back a long way. Young women now would go, what? As I did on many occasions then, but things have changed a lot now. And I think with speech processing, a good, clear female voice is actually easier to process, possibly, than a male voice.
Yeah, I guess so. And how long does it take to record a whole line of train announcements? Because I'm guessing it's very different to recording a straight voiceover. Like, it's kind of disconnected in a way. It comes together later.
Yes, I think the word is concatenated or something like that by the computer. So the phrases are put together by the computer. So you'll get a script that will look like lots of little phrases, lots of bits of things like change at, and. So you'll get a phrase like, this train is for, and then you've got to do all the stations, which will run on from that particular phrase. So you have to inflect it. Inflection is the movement of the voice up and down pitch. You inflect it in a way that hopefully it all works together smoothly. So when the computer puts it together, it sounds like it's one sort of natural speech phrase.
Yeah. And just for my own listening pleasure, can you give us a good old Mind the Gap announcement?
Actually, I don't say mind the gap on its own. On the Piccadilly line, we have, please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
Nice, yeah. Is it weird hearing your own voice when you go on the train?
It's a regular experience. I've had it many times. I actually live on the Piccadilly line in London.
Wow.
So whenever I go into town, all those years I was going into Soho to the studios, I'd be hearing my own voice. I also occasionally go up to Cambridge to a flute teacher there, and I'm on that line. I go down to Brighton to see friends. I'm on that line. So yes, I'm all over the shop. Greater Anglia, if I go to see a friend in Norfolk, I'm on that line. So yeah, I hear myself quite a lot.
Yeah. Does it ever maybe get annoying, like hearing your own voice announce that there's a delay? Do you get annoyed at yourself?
No, I only get annoyed because when I hear myself, I've always got one ear to how could I have done it better.
Yeah.
And I only get annoyed if I hear something that I could have done better.
Yeah, I suppose so. And do you ever do the voice when you're on a train just to kind of mess with people?
No, but I have been on. I was actually on the Piccadilly line once with a friend and another friend of his who didn't know me, and my voice came over the airwaves, and he turned to his friend and said, "Oh, this is Jules," and she said, "Oh my goodness," and was sort of listening, and then she said, "Do it." So I repeated the announcement that we just had, and she kind of shrieked, and a few other heads turned in the carriage. So that's happened on a few occasions.
Yeah, that's quite impressive. So I take it because you'd done the Piccadilly line, that sort of led you to be able to do all these other trains?
Well, I started with the other trains first. As I said, back in the 80s with the very early sort of speech processing. I started, I think, with Southern Region or one of those, possibly. I don't remember what the first line I did was. And it was only in the sort of, I think it was, I'm trying to think when we did the Piccadilly line, it was probably about 15 years ago. And we've done updates as Heathrow Terminal 5 came online, those sort of things. But it was because of those people that I did the original mainline railways for, that when the Piccadilly line people, London Transport, came to them and said, we need this, they said, why not use Jules?
Yeah. And you mentioned about the updates. How often do you have to do them? Because I think, every so often there's a station that's closed, and I think it's still this usual announcer voice, your voice, that does that. So is it quite often that you're kind of called up to do this?
Yes, depending on the line. I mean, I haven't done any updates for the Piccadilly line for yonks, because we had Heathrow Terminals 4 and then 5. And so there were updates for those because I don't think they were there when we first did it. But all the other train lines, yes, I mean, there have been COVID announcements recently to be updated on a lot of lines. Occasionally they change the wording of something. If a station closes, then they just have to take it out of the processing bit. And that would be easy. They just delete, I suppose, that station and delete it from any phrase that you hear it in. But if things get added, then yes, there would be an update.
Yeah. And do you like the kind of anonymity as well of, being this well-known voice that's part of thousands of people's daily lives, but you wouldn't get recognised on the street, really?
No, absolutely not. Now, I've always loved that because I've always rather felt for very famous people, because I think it must be very much a two-edged sword. There are perks, but my gosh, there's a downside as well. And I remember going into my greengrocer once, and they had Capital Radio blaring out of the speakers. And there was an ad that I'd done playing while I was kind of saying to the guy, I'll have a pound of sprouts, please. And nobody batted an eyelid. They didn't compute the two things. They didn't recognise the voice or anything. So, yes, it's very convenient, I think.
Yeah, that must be nice. What would you say is your favourite project that you've worked on in terms of voice work?
Gosh, favourite project. I spent a wonderfully funny afternoon with the adorable Jan Ravens. Do you know who I mean?
Oh, yeah, impressionist.
Dead Ringers, yep. Best Theresa May ever. Jan and I spent a very happy afternoon working with the Think Electric people. Do you remember those ads? They had the Aardman puppets, and it was different animals talking about electricity. And so we were just busking a lot of stuff to give them ideas, really. And so we did some flamingos from Birmingham, and we did South African rhinoceros, and I remember doing a rabbit, a Welsh rabbit, very high pitched she was, and I think we did some Scottish deer. And so we were just doing it as kind of conversations to play with ideas for the creatives. That was good fun. I think the favourite job that I've never done that I would love to do is the sort of wildlife documentary. I mean, I've done a fair few documentaries, but largely about weird things. I did a very strange thing for Channel 5 years ago now about a man called Armin Maivis, I think his name was, German guy, who advertised on the internet for somebody who wanted to be cannibalized.
Ooh.
And he did, yes, very bizarre. And don't let's go any further with that. But yes, that was done. I couldn't look at the pictures half the time, but that was weird but fascinating. But I love those sort of wildlife documentaries and would love to be the voice of those.
Yeah.
I think a nice soft voice that kind of draws you in and isn't intrusive is really important for those kind of things. And I think that's my forte.
Yeah, I guess your voice would work for that. You could be the understudy for David Attenborough.
Well, now there's a thing. Yes, yeah. That would be wonderful.
Yeah. And do you get up to anything else in your spare time when you're not doing voice work? Because you play the flute, I gather.
I do play the flute. In fact, we had a very funny session yesterday morning standing outside the church we usually play in the cemetery, socially distanced, with the wind trying to blow over our music stands, with the music attached to the stand with clothes pegs, and trying to hear one another, which is difficult when you're socially distant. So it wasn't a great success, but it was great to be able to play with other people. So there's that. I love that. And I wrote a novel, actually, some years ago, which is about, it's a I suppose you'd call it it's a metaphysical rom-com, let's call it. A metaphysical rom-com. It's about a man called Ray Half, who is an A-list Hollywood movie star who has everything materially, but very little emotionally or spiritually. Uh-huh. And he gets a kind of wake up call as when he's on his way to present at the Golden Globes one year. Yeah. And it has some funny angels in it and a reincarnating dog. So it's a bit weird, but I think I've had some very nice reviews at Amazon for it. It's called Ray's Game.
Ray's Game. Have to check that out.
By Jules Berry. I published it under the name of Jules Berry because there's a Julie Berry in America who writes kids' books.
Oh, yeah. And I know that you're kind of on your way to retirement, but are there any projects that you're sort of working on at the moment?
No, I mean, I'm still doing commercial work in my home studio, which I've had for 20 years. Most of what I get asked to do these days is, I hate to say it, for funeral parlours and care homes. Oh. They've clocked my numbers, I think, and so that's kind of what I'm useful for now. But I mean, I still get some things, jewellers coming up to Valentine's Day, and they want something soft and warm. They'll ask me sometimes, but I don't do any marketing these days because I just can't be bothered. So I just do what comes in, and mostly that's clients who've known me for yonks, and so I'm happy to do that. Yeah.
Well, where are we able to keep up to date with you online and also commission you if that's possible, if people are interested?
julieberry.com will find me.
Nice.
That has examples of my voiceover work on it and contact form and what have you.
Nice. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure. Thank you.